learned. The Muslims generally relied on what's called in the West a cosmological argument for the existence of God. The arguments for the existence of God fall into three categories in the West, generally. Arguments from reason, which are called ontological arguments, and there's a few different versions of that. The most famous is Saint Anselm, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury from the 13th century. And then the second most famous is Descartes, which is a slightly modified version of that. And that's still it's also a modern, that's probably the one that's had the most lasting power because it's the most difficult to deal with. And then the second is those arguments from the world, that argue from the world, the existence of the world, and those are cosmological arguments. And the most famous, and even the Western formulation of the cosmological argument is St. Thomas Aquinas, who got it from the Muslims, because it is a Muslim argument. And there is a version of that now in Western philosophy because of Watt's contribution called the Kalam cosmological argument for the existence of God, which is now in textbooks in philosophy. They're beginning to have chapters on that because they recognize that the Muslim contribution was a unique contribution. And then the third category is what are called teleological, which are arguments for the existence of God from particulars in the world. There's a fourth, which is Kant's, because Kant, when he wrote the Critique of Pure Reason, which he basically gave very powerful arguments against all three of those. And since then, since Kant, they haven't been, you can't take them seriously, as they say in philosophy. But he did it in order to introduce his proof. So he wasn't trying to destroy those proofs. What he was trying to do is put it on a stronger foundation, and he introduced the moral argument for the existence of God. And there is a fifth argument, which is really the true Muslim argument for the existence of God, which is called the fitra argument. And there is a version of that in the West, which is called the common sense argument for the existence of God, which is that the majority of human beings do believe in the noumenal realm. They believe that there is intelligent power behind the universe. And that's the overwhelming majority of human beings. And that is the fitrah. And we believe that. You can have misunderstandings of that, like in animism, naturalism, pantheism, but there's still a basic understanding. Atheism is actually a small minority, and it's an anti-fitra group because they're always people. You'll never get children that are atheists. It's extremely rare. I know of somebody, a German Jewish philosopher, that did say that he was an atheist by 8, which I find really, that would be hard to believe. Although Muslims do believe that you can have aql before puberty, so you can be rational before puberty. And 7 is what's called sinnu tamyiz. So from that point of view, it might be. But children that are still in a fitra state will not. We don't believe that. And that's what the Prophet ﷺ said, that children are born on fitra. And children are deeply spiritual. And there's only one book that I know of, which was published in Harvard on the spirituality of children. Most children have no problem understanding God. And one of the interesting things about children is that they do not question the will of God. A child will never say, why is this happening to me? I don't deserve this. Like if a child gets cancer, they won't get angry that they've got cancer. And anybody that's ever worked in cancer wards, pediatric cancer wards, will testify to this. They're very accepting of what happens to them. And I read a book by a man who lost his eyesight when he was a young boy, and he said he was so happy that it was when he was a child, because had he been an adult, he probably would have gotten angry at God. But because he was a child, he just accepted it. What I find personally for myself is I find whenever I read the Quran with tadabbur, I get increase in my iman. I mean, I have found that in my own personal life. And I know a son of a scholar who's also a scholar who told me that he went through a period of a lot of doubt in his life. And his father, who was a great commentator of the Quran, told him to read the Quran and ponder its meanings. And he said that that was a healing for him. And I personally believe that our greatest proof is the Quran, but the Quran's a very difficult book. It's easy from one perspective, but it's very difficult from another perspective. And I think anybody that says otherwise is just doing a disservice to Revelation. That's why it's always talking about ulul albab, people of innermost pith, people of intellect. So in terms of proofs, I'm interested. The thing about the West is that they're still thinking about this stuff very seriously, and they do take God seriously at one level. They're on both sides. People like Dawkins, Richard Dawkins, who's an evolutionist, just really wants to prove that God doesn't exist. Stephen Hawking is another one. His goal in life is to prove that the universe does not need a God. I mean, he's actually stated that. And his wife left him because she was a devout Christian. And she actually got to the point where she just could not live with him. So there are people that, that's how serious. And that's why I'm saying they take it very serious. And I would say that for us, there are really interesting developments, what they call the anthropic principle, the strong and weak anthropic principle. One of the things that there's a lot of evidence that there is not life in other parts of the universe, because all of the necessary things that would have to come together in order for life to exist are just, it's mind-boggling. And they've studied this. Just the resonance of atoms, what they're resonating at. The solar system, the actual distance we are from the sun, the biosphere, the gases, the coming together of all the gases. It just goes on and on and on. That's very interesting. The teleological proof for the existence of God, which is what they sometimes call the design proof, is also having a revival. People like, I think it's called Behe or Behe or B, I don't know, Behe, who wrote Darwin's Black Box. He's a chemist from University of Pennsylvania, I think. And in that book, he argues that the cell is far too complicated to be explained by evolution. There's just not enough time, because we have reasonable estimates of how long our solar system has been here. And he says that statistically it's just not possible. There has to be design behind the cell, because Darwin made the assumption that the protoplasma was a simple substance. He did not think that it would get more complicated as you went into the cell. He thought it would get more simple. And his idea being that evolution comes from simplicity, it moves into complexity. What they're finding is it gets more complex the more you go down. And so these people are they're making interesting arguments. There's also been some really interesting moral arguments that have been developed. There's a book called Evidence for God that was written by a lawyer. He was he was in the Reagan administration. He argues that, he said, for years I was just a Machiavellian nihilistic politician, and he said, I don't care what you say, if you don't have a foundation for morality based in the transcendent, there is no foundation. It doesn't matter. You can argue rational, secular, humanist principles all you want. In the end of the day, if you choose to be a moral person because you think somehow there's a rational basis for it, there's 100 million other people out there that can say, well, I choose not to be moral because I don't find a rational basis for it. So I don't like you, I can kill you. And unfortunately, there's people like that. Literally, people like that just have no qualms about killing people. So I think that we as Muslims have a lot of work to do. We need to study our texts. We can laugh at our scholars in some clever way. I would never do that, but I'm just saying people that get very clever can think, oh, well, those proofs aren't really... all those proofs are still problems. These things have not been resolved. And so we need to look deeply at our scholars. We need to assess. A lot of these books have not been read for centuries. And I'm not joking. A lot of our books have not been read for centuries. So we don't know what we even have. And I would really encourage, I would not go into theology without a grounding in our tradition, personally. I think it's a very dangerous thing to do. And I think that if you go into philosophy, it's very dangerous. I personally would warn against that. And it's a fard kifaya. to know what's out there. I mean, that is a fard kifaya. Radd al-shubuhat, what's called refutation of obfuscations, is a fard kifaya. It's a collective obligation upon the ummah. And we have to have people that study. And the thing about Imam al-Ghazali is he learned the entire philosophical tradition of his age. I mean, he learned it. Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi said he swallowed it whole, and when he wanted to vomit it up, he couldn't. In other words, it became part of his discourse and his understanding, and you see it in his writings. He was absolute genius. But we have people scoff at evolution who've never studied biology. And I'm sorry, that is just not an argument. That's called taqleed, where you just argue because, well, it doesn't agree with the Quran, therefore it's wrong. Why? Because the Quran is from God. Well, why is the Quran from God? Because God said so. Where did God say so? In the Quran. And this is the type of circular reasoning that drives scientific people insane about religious people, because what they say basically then is that your religion is not based on foundation. It's based on basic beliefs that have no foundation. And a basic belief is a belief without foundation. Right? A basic belief, if I say, why do you believe that? I don't need to tell you why. I just believe it. And our ulama accept that as a belief in God, and I respect that. I don't disrespect that at all. But our scholars cannot be like that. The people that debate, the people that write books, the people they can't be like that, because then you have no proofs. I mean, that's what a hujjah is. That's why Imam al-Ghazali was hujjat al-Islam, because he could sit down with anybody and stand firm in his faith, not just with naql, but with aql.